This week, I am joined by Jonathan Malm. Jonathan is author of Don't Burn Out, Burn Bright, along with Jason Young. He's done a lot of great projects. Many of you out there may use things that he does through SundaySocial.tv, or you may have been to ChurchStageDesignIdeas.com. And so those are his brainchilds and creations. And so we're very excited to have you on the podcast today, Jonathan. Learn just a little bit more about this topic of burnout, which is so key for leaders to avoid, not to embrace, but to learn how to process through that. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So welcome, Jonathan. Glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always fun to get into these podcasts.
Yes, for sure. Well, let's start off. For those listeners who may not know you too well, share with us just a little bit about your story, your journey, Sunday Social, and some of those ChurchStageDesignIdeas.com days.
Yes. Yeah. So I probably the first memories that I have are growing up. My parents were missionaries in Guatemala. So that was a fun experience.
Yeah.
Just experiencing the country, and it was in the middle of a civil war. So I remember a few nights like being worried that I was going to get kidnapped. I was never kidnapped, but there were some crazy things happening in that area. Then we moved back to the US. My dad got a chance to pastor a church that had just gone through a massive church split. Lawsuit pending, $1 million in debt. The current property run down because we were planning on building a building. So we purchased property that we couldn't afford. So $1 million in debt, current building run down, 75 people left. It was just a fun situation. To get involved in ministry. That's where I started working in ministry. I went to college during that time and then came on staff full time doing worship leading, media, volunteers, everything that you do, and then slowly getting to specialize as the church grew and as we got more volunteers on board. But I have a heart for the church. And as a pastor's kid and as a former staff member, I somehow survived and didn't burn out. Don't hate the church. Don't hate mega churches. Don't hate small churches. Don't hate pastors. Somehow I was the one who survived. And then, I just love resourcing the church in whatever ways I find. So ChurchStageDesignIdeas.com was one of those that I started. We were trying to update this building that was built in the 70s, and everyone in town had been to that church, and so they all knew what the church was, but we weren't that church anymore. So part of redesigning the stage was just whenever people walked in, setting expectations for what they could expect from the service. So I was blogging about that. People kept finding my website based on searching for church stage design ideas, and I realized, there's apparently a need here for this. I didn't know that other people were doing that. So I began to, pull some research together, asking other people what they were doing. I used Twitter, which was blooming at that time. And that's how I built that. And then, I've just since started different projects as I see, things that I was doing at my church. Wow, other churches must be needing the same sort of thing. So Sunday Social was birthed out of that, realizing that, it used to be all about keep it Sunday saint, focusing on the Sunday morning service. Yeah. And suddenly there was this necessity to communicate with people throughout the week and give them good quality content and encourage them and keep them engaged. So that's what Sunday Social was birthed out of, the idea of helping churches who are already under-resourced, overworked, to be able to put out quality content on their social media throughout the week. And that's mostly what I do now, along with writing with, like you said, my co-writer, Jason Young. We love writing books together. We somehow found this great mix of personality and expertise that works well for us.
How many books do you guys have together now?
We have 1, 2, 3, 4, I think about 5 now. So it's been, we're in a rhythm. It's pretty fun.
Partnership. Yeah.
I'm blessed to have, same thing with Sunday Social. I have a partner that we've worked together for 7 years, and egos have not become problematic. And, it's fun to be able to have enduring partnerships that you're still grateful for.
Yeah, that's great. I love y'all's heart for really helping those local church leaders. And it comes birthed out of living that, right? Being in that local context, even with your dad pastoring a church, but you being on staff and understanding, hey, one of the things that leads to burnout is there's a never ending supply of Sundays that are coming, right?
Yeah.
That old cliche, and you're trying to engage people, you're trying to engage the culture, and especially for a church staff member, that can just over time get
Oh,
daunting.
yeah.
But maybe let's use that as a little transition point to talk about the book that you guys have, Don't Burn Out, Burn Bright. Talk to us
Yeah.
just a little bit. Why did you guys write this book?
So, of course, we all experienced a pretty traumatic event in our lives about, 3 years ago, this little virus that ran around the world.
Yeah.
And especially pastors, I saw my pastor at the church where I'm involved navigating this complex issue that, if you have services, if you don't have services, if you require masks, if you don't require masks, you're going to make half of your people mad, probably more like 80% of your people mad. It was it was a horrible thing to go through as an individual. It was really horrible to go through as a church because, as a pastor, you're just trying to help people navigate this. You're trying to help them deal with anxiety, deal with anger we were all dealing with. And you had to make decisions that were difficult. And the heart was there. The heart was for people, but people weren't getting that. They were just getting mad about the politics of it or the whatever specific element of it was. So me and Jason, we both saw so many pastors burning out, or if not, just hanging on by a thread. So a lot of pastors weathered that COVID time, but then 2 years after 2020, they left the ministry, or they lost their faith, or something way worse. Um, so we had this heart. We're like, how can we write to this? How can we speak into this topic? And we've heard stories of pastors that have, had books about burnout on their shelf. And when an elder sees that, they fire the pastor because there's this sort of like, if you're dealing with burnout, you're probably not going to last very long. And you might, be prone to a moral failure or to getting some wacky theology into the pulpit. And there's a lot of fear about burnout. So there's a lot of books about burnout, but we wanted to create a book that was sort of an anti-burnout book. Once you're heading toward burnout, you probably need to deal with counseling, and it's a slow road to get out of it. But how can you actually avoid burnout? How can you create healthy, high capacity leadership and last in ministry for the long haul? Because we have seen pastors that do that. I mean, Rick Warren's one of those examples that, man, that guy, it was just really cool to see his ministry and how he turned it over to the next pastor. It seems like it's rare. It's not. There's more that do it than we realize, but we tend to focus on all the people who go out in a blaze of glory. But we do believe it's possible to last in ministry for the long haul, and we wanted to create a resource to help pastors and ministry leaders do that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I was serving as an executive pastor in a church during that time and season, and you're so right. I mean, I was used to, as a leader, you make a decision and some people are upset, right?
Yeah,
Like,
always. Yeah, a few.
it's not really leadership if that's not happening. What I wasn't prepared for was we'd make a decision and everyone would be upset.
Yes.
And you're just trying your best to make it through. And we definitely see that at Vanderbloemen, just the number of people who afterwards have just left. And from
Yeah.
a job market standpoint, there are just way less people in ministry right now, and way more churches with needs. So I love that
And
you guys.
there's a whole lot more realtors and health coaches, and that seems to be the two or
Yeah.
three things that former ministry leaders get involved in.
Yep, absolutely. And so I love y'all's focus to say, hey, how do we deal with this well before we get there? Because that really was partly my experience, was those team members who were really ready beforehand. Man, they kept driving through, and they thrived. Their families
Yeah.
thrived through that. So maybe talk us through at the beginning. I think you have a little burnout assessment, right?
Yeah.
That you guys put together. Talk us through the burnout assessment a little bit.
Yeah, so there's a burnout assessment at don'tburnoutburnbright.com. It's free, it's anonymous. Again, we're not going to send the results to your pastor or to your elders. and let them see all your dirty laundry and why they need to fire you. But the goal of it was to, we talk about this in the first chapter of the book, is you need to understand where your potential for burnout might come from, because it's not a one size fits all. It's not a single factor that causes people to burn out. Because I'll post videos frequently about burnout on my Instagram, and people will say like, oh, you just need a, if you're burning out, it's because you're doing something you're not called to do. I'm like,
Yeah.
oof, talk about all the pastors burning out and tell them that and see.
Yeah.
Or they say, you need to learn how to rest. And I'm like, okay, yes, we need to learn how to rest. But there are also people who are just killing it, going 100 miles an hour, and they're able to last, right? So we often so easily distill it to one idea. Like, if you just spend time in the word, you're going to not burn out. And then you have leaders that they're not even Christian and they're not burning out. So obviously that's not fully it, right? Like, but the spiritual side is obviously a factor, right? So there were sort of 10 warning signs, or 10 areas that we identified that we see that leadership tend to burn out. And so when you go through that assessment, it just asks you some questions to kind of gauge where you are, what area you might need to focus on. And it's been cool. We've gotten a lot of feedback from people taking it, saying, yeah, this has actually confirmed some stuff I've been hearing from my counselor, or things that I kind of felt, I sensed that was the case, and it was just nice to get that confirmation. And then we tied in ultimately to the book, just saying, okay, now what do you do with that? Here's actually the chapter where we talk about that, because we don't want to just identify the problem and then leave you there, say, good luck, here's the problem.
Yeah. Well, which that really helps define reality, right? But one of the things you guys talk about is that denying your reality is the worst thing you can do in leadership.
Yeah.
Maybe let's talk about that a little bit.
That's especially in certain church circles, there's this sort of denial element of it, and we often say it's faith, and there's this balance, right? Like, there's this balance between faith and denying the reality of the situation. I remember I had a friend that attended Bible college, and one of their friends at Bible college was saying, yeah, my cousin is he's been sleeping for a few months. And they're like, sleeping? What do you mean he's been sleeping? Yeah, he's in the hospital, he's been sleeping. He's like, do you mean your cousin's in a coma? And the guy said, oh, we don't use that word. That's not a word of faith, right? Like, that's not a faith word, right? And it's kind of a funny example, right? Yeah. But like, it's not funny the person's in a coma, obviously, but the sort of like, you're denying the fact that like there's a medical issue here that we need to address, right? And there's this temptation sometimes to, and we do this in ministry. We have to see a vision for something that is not necessarily our reality. I want to reach our city for Jesus. Right now we have 50 people in our church. So obviously we're not doing that, but I believe it's possible. We do speak in faith. We do live from a place of faith. But if we only live there and don't also acknowledge reality, we can often be in a state of denial where we say, yes, I'm exhausted and I don't see any end in sight and I need to do something, otherwise I'm going to burn out. So that is the first step, is acknowledging something needs to change.
Yeah, so often that can be difficult, though. You mentioned even seeing the burnout book on the shelf can lead to the elders questioning, or even if there's not an actual disciplinary step taken, the whispers start up, or the people projecting onto, right? And those can be really difficult things in church life. For sure.
Because there's that myth that if you're just rock and rolling with Jesus, you're not going to burn out. Right. And if I'm burning out, I must not have enough faith, or I must not be, one-on-one with Jesus. There's something wrong with me, that this high pressure situation is breaking me. What's wrong with me? Like, no, it's
interesting. You look in the Gospel of John, and what's the first thing the disciples do immediately after the whole death and resurrection? They're like, I'm
They're
going
freaking out.
this, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm done with this. Like I'm going to do this other thing. And Jesus comes and pulls them back in from it. And it's almost as if they were not willing to deal with the reality of, no, this really just happened. And now there's a call on your life to go. And I think sometimes when we experience burnout, we're willing to lay down the call of God on our life simply because we just need a season of rest. But too many
Yeah.
times look at it as you said, no, we just lay down the call completely. So
I think there is I mean, I talk about this sometimes with people who they feel called to ministry and they're so disillusioned that they feel like they need to step away from their church.
mhm.
And I think there's this myth that ministry happens in church. It does happen in church. And I'm not trying to say everyone needs to quit their church and just, but we distill our calling to a profession.
Right.
And that's problematic because I don't work in a church. I work with, thousands of churches, but I get to minister through them. And or then there's people that, work my current pastor, he before he was a pastor, he worked in the restaurant industry, and his ability to minister and pastor the people in that restaurant, the gifts and callings of God are without repentance. Like that calling is on your life, whatever your job is. So sometimes we need to separate. Okay, yes, you can step away from working at a church for a season or working in that high stress environment for a season, and you can still be operating within your calling.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's good. You guys talk about values and kind of letting values lead to life and longevity in leadership. Maybe talk about that just a little bit about going about setting up those values and how you've seen them lead to that longevity.
Yeah, there's this tendency, and when we use the word values, I think sometimes you can say, like values as in, keeping integrity, keeping a pure heart, a pure mind. That's not necessarily, that is what we're talking about, but we're also talking about simpler things like the value of not letting money dictate what you do. So that really big giver, that really big tither who has unlimited access to you, there's this fear that if I don't give this person unlimited access to me, they're not going to give, and then the ministry is going to crumble.
Yeah.
And so we compromise a value for the sake of the organization, and it can lead to poor boundaries, which is another thing we talk about. Or we feel the pressure that the church needs to grow, like it needs to grow. It can't be successful if it's only 100 people, and that's a misplaced value, right? Like the growth is a good indicator of health and of good things happening, but it's not the only indicator. And we can focus on the wrong thing, and it can lead to some poor decisions that will wear us out.
Yeah. So let's lean in on boundaries a little bit more there because you guys do talk quite a bit about that. How do
Mhm.
relational boundaries actually show more love, not less love?
So one of the things that I see people do,
Counterintuitive. This one's counterintuitive because we're like, no,
yeah,
the more time we have, right? I love you more, right? Yeah.
yeah, I remember navigating this idea in the book. I'm like, okay, how do I get from this point to this point? And it was this journey you have to take people on to understanding that the best thing you can say is no. I see so many people who don't know how to say no, and they say yes, but they say it begrudgingly, and they say it with kind of this anger in their heart, and it just becomes more and more and more angry, which then leads to them just like, that's it, I'm giving up, I'm done, I'm not going to do any of this. But I've found that when I can say no joyfully, it frees me up to say yes joyfully.
Mm,
So, this is something my dad helped me understand, is that, I was in college, I was, studying, I was working at the church. I also had my friend group. I also needed some time to recharge. And people would ask me to help with something. Hey, I need you to design this graphic. I know it's after work hours. Can you do it? And, I was going to go hang out with my friends. So I was like, well, yes, I can. I have time. I'm having to give up spending time with my friends or give up, dating my wife, but I have time, I can do it. And my dad helped me realize that downtime is a valid use of your time.
Mm.
Rest, relaxation,
Look,
recharging.
I want you to say that again for
Yes.
every pastor who's listening who needs to hear that right now. Say it again.
Rest is a valid use of your time. It is something I learned that I have to schedule into my day and I have to prioritize. So when I say yes to someone, I'm saying no to rest, or I'm saying no to a relationship. And so I don't. I can I what I learned is I can actually not be a liar, not come from a place of lying. I can say, no, I do not have time to help you with that because my rest is valid. My rest, the time that I need to devote to this is valid. So I can say, no, I don't have time for this. But then when I do have time that I say, okay, I actually do have a slot in my schedule where there's nothing filled there, I can say yes joyfully. Like I would, because I love, that's the problem is people in ministry, they want to help. You get into ministry because you want to help people. You want to be involved. You don't want to take it easy. You're not looking for a cushy job, like you want to get into the mud, into the weeds and work with people. But if we don't know how to say no, and if we don't believe that our rest and downtime is valid, then we're going to say yes, and we're going to say it begrudgingly, which is not going to help us. It's not going to help the person ultimately.
Yeah. It's almost like the Lord might set aside something that tells us about having rest and
It's almost like there was like some pretty angry conversations in the Old Testament about not keeping that rest holy.
I love how Jesus talks about though, like Sabbath was made for man, right?
Yeah.
Not man for the Sabbath.
It shocks me though how important the Sabbath was. Like there are prophets that was their whole thing. Like you are not resting, like an angry judgment upon Israel. It actually kind of makes sense why the Pharisees were the way they were, because like there were prophetic punishments that happened because they weren't keeping the Sabbath day holy. They weren't resting. Man, God takes it seriously. It's crazy.
Well, if you play that out, it's because he knows us. He knows that when we just keep going and going and going and going, it's going to lead to that burnout. And you could think of that in the seventh day Sabbath, but I think there's also those. What is the Sabbath within the day, right? That you're talking
Yeah.
about, rest that rejuvenates, recharges you. It reinvigorates you for the work of the ministry. And as you said,
Yeah.
if we can view ministry not just as our jobs, but it's just who we are because we're followers of Jesus, then some of those pressures and burdens get released. Not necessarily that, hey, you got deadlines, got to get things done, but if I'm investing into people who don't know who Jesus is outside of work, then suddenly that's not work anymore. That's just the natural rhythm of life. And I can make those good relational boundaries.
Yeah, and I think one of the difficult things about this concept of Sabbath for us is that Sabbath in Bible times was in a farm situation or a fisher situation. It was people who are working physically outside and they were getting physically exhausted. Hey, listen, I work in front of a computer. I'm not, chopping wood all day. My body doesn't need that rest. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm spending emotional energy. I'm spending some physical energy, but it's emotional energy that's the big problem for me. So what's so important is not just resting my body, not having that Saturday where I'm not doing anything physical, because you can do something physical. It probably is actually a good idea to do something physical on your Sabbath day. Instead, we need to find a way to shut off that emotional energy or that brain energy and let that rest. And that's what's so hard for people is, no, I'm not working. I'm responding to an email, or I'm just kind of thinking about that problem all day that is coming on Sunday, right? And we don't get rest because we need to understand that it's an emotional and mental thing that we're resting, a Sabbath that we need to take, not just a physical one.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. All right, last question. What one thing do you want ministry leaders to know after reading this book?
Oh man, I would like them to feel encouraged that there are subtle tweaks. I don't think most ministry leaders are, well, let's look at it like this. Like, if you keep your car running well, you change your oil here and there, you align your wheel, you do subtle tweaks to your car. It can run at high capacity, it can run at a high speed. It's only when we neglect it for long term that Ferrari only can go 10 miles an hour or can't go at all. So I want to encourage pastors, ministry leaders, make those small tweaks. Just check in on your soul from time to time. Check in on how are you doing? Where is your health level? And what tweaks can you make so you can go at a high speed? I do believe that high capacity leadership is possible and burnout is not inevitable in those situations, but it requires those constant little tweaks we got to do. And I would love churches and ministries to embrace that idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Jonathan, it has been great to meet you and chat and have this time today. How can people find out more about Don't Burn Out, Burn Bright, and more just about the work that you and Jason are doing?
Yeah. So again, don'tburnoutburnbright.com is the website that has some bonus materials, like a leadership guide. You can walk through your staff with this. A personal reflection guide. So you can, as you're going through the book, you can kind of read and answer some questions. It has that assessment, and yeah, all the links to all the places you can purchase the book. Then if you want to follow me more, I'm on Instagram. I make silly little videos about what it's like to work at a church. They're fun, and people seem to be liking them. So it's just at Jonathan Malm on Instagram, and you can direct message me there. I love talking to people and meeting new people. So.
Awesome. Well, Jonathan, great to meet you. Thanks for being here. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this episode of the Vanderbloemen Leadership Podcast, and we will see you on the next episode.